Good morning or good afternoon, everyone. Hello. Welcome to today's session on managing psychosocial risk in the workplace. It looks like we have a large number of people joining us from all around the country, so welcome to you all. I'm currently in Melbourne, presenting to you from the traditional lands of the Kulin Nation, specifically the Woiwurrung and Boonwurrung tribes. The Melbourne Docklands area has been an important meeting place for local tribes for many thousands of years. With an abundance of both fresh and saltwater produce available, it was possible for large gatherings to meet here for trade, celebrations, the sharing of knowledge and other social activities. We too are gathered to share ideas and knowledge with the aim of making a genuine improvement to people's lived experience of work. As we meet today, it's important that we pay our respects to the traditional custodians of this land and acknowledge that Australia is home to the oldest continuing living culture on Earth. So again, welcome to everyone that has made the effort to attend today. Welcome to our panellists who I will introduce, or they will introduce themselves more formally in a moment. But today's session, just to recap, is we'll build on our first webinar on this topic late last year, which created lots of great conversation. So we hope that today's session will do the same for you and your businesses. We will seek today input from our panel on what has evolved since then in terms of the regulatory landscape, in terms of what is and what isn't working from a business perspective, and equally the multifaceted approach that's required to address these complex issues moving forward. We'll look to structure the session into three segments. One of the things we want to enable is as many questions from the audience as possible. So at the end of each session, we'll pause, open up for questions, but ask you in the meantime if you can populate your questions into the Q&A function, which is, I believe, in the towards the bottom left of my screen. Hopefully it's in the same spot for you, but if you look at the bar beneath. A couple of housekeeping items as well. You do not need to take copious amounts of notes. Please do if you wish, but there will be a recording of the webinar sent out next week, along with some key takeaways, which you will all have access to and can share with others through your business as well. So without further ado, I'll now hand over to our panel to introduce themselves before we kick off. And Steve, perhaps I could start with you.
Great, thanks, Aaron, and thanks for the opportunity to come and speak again with you and Jane and Dave. I think it was about 6 months ago we were doing this, and a lot has solidified over that little period. So my name's Steve Bell. I'm a partner. I'm the managing partner here of the employment team at Herbert Smith Freehills, and the work I do is in the area of work health and safety, which covers the area that we're going to be talking about today.
Thank you, Steve. Jane.
Thank you. So I'm Jane Bourke, and I'm coming from the Woiwurrung country down in Ocean Grove in Victoria, where it's nice and sunny but cold. And I'm currently the Director of Safety, Health and Wellbeing at Woolworths across the whole group. So probably the largest employer here in Australia, with about 200,000 employees across Australia, New Zealand, and a small footprint in Asia as well. And excited to be back. I feel like it's only a month ago that I spoke to Dave and Steve about this topic, but yeah, a lot has happened and will continue to evolve. Thank you.
Great. Thanks for joining again, Jane. And it does seem like only a month ago, but time flies when you're having fun, they say. Dave, over to you.
So I'm Dave Burroughs. I'm a workplace psychologist, and I've been specialising in psychological health and safety, some would say for far too long, probably 15 years or more. I support a number of Australian organisations and international organisations from the board level right down to operational levels in the development and implementation and evaluation of psychological health and safety approaches and strategies. So that's me.
Thanks, Dave. Looking forward to your contribution today as well. So Steve, we might kick off perhaps with yourself and a bit of a, given it has been 6 months and as you've referenced, a lot has evolved and changed in that period of time. Perhaps we could get you to give us a little bit of an update on the latest changes from a regulatory landscape perspective, and I guess the impact that you've seen perhaps in the clients that you're working with since it has been rolled out in various states.
Cool, thanks, Aaron. So I guess there's three kind of legal streams which underpin, in my mind, the journey which industry and society, frankly, is on this topic. The first stream is work health and safety laws. So as we all know on this call, every state and territory has its own work health and safety, or in Victoria, Occupational Health and Safety Act, which is regulated by a state health and safety regulator. So when we were speaking last year, there was an intent to introduce a specific set of regulations dealing with psychosocial safety and psychosocial hazards into the work health and safety regulations across the various states and territories. That has largely happened over the last 6 months. New South Wales went first, followed by Queensland, and I'll talk briefly about Queensland in a second. New South Wales now, the Northern Territory, Western Australia, Tasmania, and the Commonwealth regulating Commonwealth agencies and some peculiarly licensed large employers have all introduced what's referred to as the model set of regulations dealing with psychosocial safety. So a core duty to identify psychosocial hazards at work and to put in place a plan to eliminate them so far as reasonably practicable, or to reduce them so far as is reasonably practicable, the language of health and safety law. Queensland has introduced that model and in addition has done something else, a sort of a Rolls-Roycing of the regime, and have introduced an obligation to apply the hierarchy of risk controls, a phrase not known to many except the safety profession, but the idea that if a hazard can be eliminated, it must be eliminated. That's the obligation of an employer. That is what is reasonably practicable. A challenging idea, frankly, when it comes to something that is less rigid than a guard on a machine, something that is about the human experience. The elimination of psychosocial hazard raises a very broad question. Victoria, I'm just doing a quick around the grounds here. Victoria had put out for public comment a detailed but quite different draft set of amendments to the occupational health and safety regs. They went out for public comment. I think a lot of public comment was made. Certainly clients worked with us to make some significant comments. The intent was that by November last year, WorkSafe and the government were intending on announcing some changes to those OHS regs. In fact, it's not happened yet. It looks like the strong feedback that's been provided is being digested. And you might imagine that there's a correlation between some reforms to the workers' compensation regime, which are being mooted here in Victoria, and the introduction of these laws. So Victoria kind of status quo for the moment, and South Australia and the ACT have introduced a swag of guidance material, if not black letter law. So a lot has happened over the last little while in the work health and safety regime. It also bears noting that since we last spoke, the positive duty of care to eliminate sexual harassment or sex discrimination at work has been codified and enshrined in federal law. So work health and safety laws in the states. Now, a concurrent positive duty has been introduced at the federal level as well, particularly in relation to sexual harassment or sex discrimination at work. Two regulators regulating conceivably the same topic and the same issue. That arose out of the respective work recommendations, which, without travelling over the detail of this, the old federal government wasn't particularly interested in introducing as a separate standalone duty, saying we had enough regulation in this area, and the new government saying, no, we will follow the recommendation. And then finally, just a quick observation that there is, perhaps by coincidence and perhaps by confluence, some litigation which is arising about the lived experience at work, hinging on some employment ideas, reasonable hours of work. What is the deal? What is a fair ask of an employer? The work health and safety law doesn't expressly deal with that, but the Fair Work Act does. It says 38 hours plus reasonable additional hours. And there's some litigation happening by people challenging that question at the moment. So baseline, Aaron, and I'll make a couple of other quick points if I can, but baseline, the laws we thought were coming in are in at the state level. In addition, a positive duty of care on sexual harassment. And so the work you do in one will be good for the other, to be frank. And then concurrently, I think slowly now unwrapping the challenge of what it is to work in the Australian economy in the employment rights sphere, and in particular the hours of work cases that have gone through. Quick observation, almost despite these laws, but aligned with them, some prosecution activity in Victoria in particular, 2 companies and their directors separately prosecuted, one for permitting or engaging in sexual harassment at work, one for permitting or engaging in bullying, but with a harassment sort of overlay over the last couple of weeks, over the last 4 or 5 weeks or so. So I think in addition to this kind of rump of regulatory black letter change, there's an increased focus and an increased, demand from state safety regulators to be regulating this area. So, lots been going on.
Fantastic. Thanks for that overview, Steve. We might just go to some of the questions now that are coming through. We'll go in order as best we can. But Jeremy's question is interested to see whether industrial manslaughter could be applied to a case of been taught by failing to implement psychological safety.
Yeah, for sure. Absolutely, no question of that. Of course, this is at the grim end of thinking about safety, but an important one. For a manslaughter charge to arise, someone has to have lost their life, and in this context, you would imagine that is as a result of some physical violence being occasioned upon them. That's not unimaginable in the context of psychosocial safety, or of course a suicide. And we should say at the top, of course, we note the triggering nature of everything we're talking about, so feel free to manage that as best you can. But that is entirely conceivable that an employer has its behaviours analysed following a death at work, including in relation to the area of psychosocial safety. And so, yes, that is in the field of play.
Another question from Yashan is around, I guess, the different regulations that do exist. I guess the question here is, why is it that there is no synergy between the regulations and laws within the country? Why isn't there one flat legislation and regulation for all states in Australia? Is it a question of legacy, of different legislations? Steve, perhaps you could quickly sum that one up.
We're going to spend a lot of time this year talking about our constitution for good reason. But one of the elements of the constitution is that the Commonwealth's given certain powers over certain things, and whatever's left gets dealt with by the states. And so health and safety fits into the whatever's left category. So it's naturally the case that the states implement their own laws. But the real question is, well, why can't they just implement the same law? I mean, why the need for deviation? The human experience is the same in every state and territory, and that comes, I think, merely to the parochial nature of politics, that state governments think that their little tweaks or enhancements can add something. So, we've had national laws in rail safety, and every state and territory has adopted those national laws but tweaked them. National laws on heavy vehicle, kind of a great model for national regulation. But here we're in the tweaking zone, unfortunately.
I think Alinda's question is kind of similar, related to the workers' compensation side of things, in that Victoria's announced that the workers' comp insurance scheme will no longer cover psychosocial injury. So how will the Victorian changes then interact with the new Commonwealth changes?
Yeah, I don't think that's quite as black and white as that, but there is certainly a tightening of the types of claims which can be compensated under the workers' comp regime. This is bare finances, right? There's been a 27% on the latest figures increase in the cost of psychosocial injuries across the Victorian workforce. The majority of those, it has to be said, seem to be in the public sector, but plenty of those are in the private sector as well. And so there is a real imperative for scheme viability to assess what can be done about that. So if you're looking at that challenge, you can do two things. You can try and reduce the number of incidences occurring at all that are harming people. That's what we're talking about today. And that is what I think is, the driver behind some of this, in addition to the care and concern for employees. And then you can affect and review the compensation scheme, which I think is the plan over in Victoria. So there's no doubt those two things are travelling together in my mind, but one is independent of the other in an enforcement sense.
Yep. Okay. A question that's come through from a couple of people around, is there, or what is the difference between psychological safety and psychosocial safety from a legislative viewpoint? Are they interchangeable?
I think for present purposes they're interchangeable. I think this speaks to, and I'd love to hear from Dave on this, but I think this speaks to what is happening at the moment as we all find out and finding a phrase for that. And so, in a legal sense, I don't think there's any real distinction between those two ideas, but it does speak to this broader idea that, to be honest, I think industry, workers, HSRs, employers, safety professionals, HR professionals are all learning a new lingo, because suddenly there is a need to be quite sophisticated in the way that you think.
If I could just jump in just for 1 second there, it is, the confusion for organisations is very high. Now, psychological safety is an interpersonal construct. It is not a proxy for a mentally healthy workplace. It's not a proxy for psychosocial risk. It's not a requirement from a regulatory perspective. It is, do I feel safe to speak up without fear of repercussion or reprimand. Started in the 1950s, Carl Rogers, the creativity space. It's been popularised by Amy Edmondson. Lots of confusion there because it is an interpersonal construct. It's an important one, whereas psychological health and safety, which is really the domain of workplace health and safety, occupational health and safety related to psychosocial hazards, psychosocial harm. We're seeing new terms come up all the time here, and I think choosing the ones we're going to stick with is going to make it a lot easier to navigate for already confused employers.
I agree.
Thanks, Dave. A couple of more specific questions, or I guess a comment supporting what you were just saying there, Dave, initially, is that managing psychosocial risk is not new, e.g. identifying, reducing, minimising, etc. But the question is, what is new employer obligations in this space?
Well, I'll have a crack at that, and then I'd love to hear from Jane and Dave. But what is new? What has actually changed in the law is the expectation for a systematic way of thinking about this issue. So what is not new is the general duty of care that people should come to work and leave in the condition they arrive, or better if you can achieve it. That is not new. That's the basis of occupational health and safety law, and it's always included psychological safety. If you think about, awful extreme examples, the Brodie Panlock case here in Victoria, a waitress who was bullied to the point of taking her own life, now many, many years ago, over a decade ago, that has always been able to be regulated by work health and safety law. So extreme examples have always been in, I suppose. What is changing now is the need for having a more systematic way of thinking about psychosocial hazards, frankly, not at the extreme level, but at the more routine lived experience level, and asking, what can we do to improve the experience of people at work? Do we have a basis for saying that what we're doing is enough, or do we have clarity about what we're going to do in a written sense? That is the change, to be perfectly frank. The duty of care is what it is. What's changing now is the need to be more sophisticated, frankly, and more systematic in the way that you record your thinking on this issue and engage with work and consult and do the things that we know are core to health and safety compliance.
And Steve, I'd agree with that, basically. I think the traditional areas of sexual harassment, bullying, violence in the workplace, whether through customers or peer-to-peer, have been ones that have sort of been at the forefront for hopefully most companies to have thought about, and that we've always had this obligation. I know Dave's going to jump in a moment, and that we always should have been managing it systematically, but I think it's the shining of the light on it now through, and again, I don't know whether COVID has risen and shone a light on mental health more than it's ever had in the past. And then you've got now the legislation part that's shining the light on this around, what are we doing? And potentially around the areas that perhaps, haven't been thought about before, such as long work hours, job control, job clarity, those type of things that you go, when did that suddenly become a focus of the safety professional?
So, Jane, one of the things that I'm seeing in that space is that a lot of organisations started to recognise that all the money they've been investing in workplace mental health and awareness campaigns and mental health first aid and those sorts of things has actually not worked. And we've got the academic community finally standing up, having a voice saying it doesn't work. In fact, it can do more harm than good. So you've got this interesting situation where organisations are going, I'm spending millions of dollars, but I'm not arresting any of the cost, complexity, duration, severity of claims. I've still got people leaving. How come? And then you've got the academic community saying, well, it's because you've invested in the wrong things the last 15 years. So I think COVID's definitely shone a spotlight, but I think the understanding now around the efficacy of what's being done and the fact that we are not helping people's wellbeing at work, continuing to cause harm, has really sort of tightened up people's attention in this space.
And we'll give an example. Sorry, Aaron. Just to give an example, I was speaking to an executive team last week about this very topic. What do you do? And you're quite right, Dave. In the past, probably the discussion was, well, we have an EAP service, and we do. Everyone gets a cupcake every third month, and we've sorted psychosocial safety. Not this client was saying that, but they did talk about a specific conversation they had with a team who they know at end of financial year has a particularly high workload and it's particularly stressful, and they can't design that out of their job. That is their job. So the question is, what can they do about it? And they had, and it was just so great to hear in the room, right? This is what I think this is all about. A co-designed solution where they said, this team really needs our support on after our meals, on giving some respite, on some time in lieu, on keeping one day of the weekend sacred over this magic month where all the books need to be closed. But that I just thought was so, that is this working, that is giving people a chance, a forum now, a platform to actually have that conversation with their worker. This is not about keeping people happy at work. You don't have to be happy to be psychologically or psychosocially safe, in my view. You just need to have the opportunity to say, well, what are the most stressful parts or the most difficult parts of the job? And what is it that can be done to relieve that pressure on me, or give me a sense that it won't go forever, or give me, and frankly, give me a sense to be heard. So we were talking about this as a compliance activity. This is a value creating activity, I think, for employers to actually stare into the challenge of working and ask what can be done to make it a bit easier.
Absolutely. And we'll unpack a little bit more, Jane, perhaps in a moment, but around what is and what isn't working in an organisational context. But I guess a couple of other questions, Steve, before we do is, one here is, how likely is it that a company would be prosecuted under the new obligations for failing to ensure employees do not suffer psychosocial risks in environments where those risks may have been standard in the workplace for a very long period of time? So issues where employees may be stressed, feel overworked, or feel underutilised come to mind.
Well, the best answer I can give to that is the Victorian example, where there have been prosecutions of hospitals for failing to manage aggressive patient behaviour against medical staff, and prosecutions against organisations that run facilities of a corrective nature for failing to manage the risk of violence against staff. So they are, inherently dangerous in a psychosocial sense, workplaces. And the regulator has said, well, it's not enough just to say, well, that's it, the job is tough. They've asked the question, what more can be done? And those organisations are doing a lot, but these are historical, prosecutions that show a willingness to take action, even if a job is inherently tough. Even if an inbound or outbound call centre leads you to customer aggression, it's not enough just to say, well, that's the job. The question is, well, what do you do to support people to minimise the chance of that occurring, or to support them if it does?
Right, thank you. Jane, we might just come to you. I mean, what you've all touched on there is, investing in the right things, and there's lots of other questions that we'll get to. But Jane, I guess in the 6 months since we last got together, what's been your experience in terms of, what has worked or is working, and equally, what has not worked?
Yeah, great question. I can remember last time sort of talking around feeling like there was a lot of reactiveness around, oh my God, these laws are coming in and what are we doing about them? And a sense of, oh my God, we don't have anything in place. And really taking that step back and going, let's step back for a moment and actually look at what do we have in place, and really understanding what that is. And then thinking about, well, how do we start looking at what further we need to put in place? So, for hopefully a lot of organisations, one of the things that we have now really clear sort of 4 pillars of our focus. So we can look at, most companies will have EAP. So one of your pillars is sort of that 24/7 response and support, but it's not just EAP. It's how do you respond to the critical incidents? It's how do you respond to the person that says, I'm not doing okay and I'm in the workplace and perhaps I've got suicidal thoughts. That is a fundamental that I hope most organisations have got in place. And then it's really looking at how do we move, and this is where some people are asking around, I can see on the questions around what's effective and what's not effective. So really moving from the thought of, we're going to fix individuals to thinking about how are we going to, in colloquial words, fix the organisation. So moving into harm prevention. So again, having a think about one of the core things for me is, and I remember talking last time and we've touched on it now, this language is tripping everyone up. So how do you get, and I don't think we as all of us on this webinar right now need to get common language. You need to get common language in your own organisation and talk about it consistently. So again, one of the pillars for us is, basically that communication and awareness, and, not just talking about destigmatizing mental health. It's about how do we actually start talking about what the organisation's role and our leaders' role are in helping people enable them in the workplace. So that's another core pillar for us. And then I think the hard one, which we talked about last time, is how do you wrap your arms around going, I know what our hazards are, and that's probably the easy part. I know Dave's going to talk about this in a little moment, and really nut out what are we doing to actually drive improvement or controls in managing these hazards. And for us, moving beyond that, just the prevent harm, but how do we actually help? And again, using language that resonates in your organization, we are using the word thrive. How do you help people come to work and actually in their job bring their best self and feel like they are actually thriving in the workplace? So again, I think, hopefully over the last 6 months, a lot of organizations are starting to, move away from, oh my God, this is a compliance thing. And that's what you're going to fail if you're seeing it as a pure compliance, and moving it into what are the key buckets or pillars that you need to focus on, and driving this. The big one is, again, more research has come out over the last 6 months about individuals and talent out there are looking for organizations that really are focused on, this concept of well-being. So again, organizations not just doing this because it's a compliance need and it's always been a compliance requirement, but actually, being something that, actually drives value for our talent.
And Jane and Dave, Steve, there's a few questions in around. One picking up, Dave, on your comment that for the last 15 years, investing in the wrong things. I guess others saying where should business and companies put their investment? What programs should be implemented? What are the right things to invest in moving forward?
There's a great research article was published just a couple of weeks ago out of the UK, basically saying that all of your individual level interventions don't work, and some of them actually do more harm to people. So your mindfulness programs, your stress management programs, all of those sorts of things, no research efficacy to support them at all. Increasingly, we're seeing.
You mean just telling people to be resilient doesn't help that?
No, go figure, Steve. Perhaps we should ask them why they need to be resilient and address those sorts of issues. But we're seeing increasing international sort of pressure now, saying that things like mental health first aid don't work. They don't improve outcomes for the individuals at all. While organisations investing in this, starting to see some issues now arise around the risks associated with peer programs as well, and how that buries some of the potential areas of psychosocial harm within the peer network itself, let alone the additional risk to the peers. So I think moving away from anything that is community-oriented, anything that is fixed individual-oriented, that's the stuff that we just need to park, that we need to forget about. That's the dark ages. Move from that. Psychosocial risk assessment, understanding the organisational barriers to wellbeing is where we need to pay attention. It's not sufficient. Good job design. Is what we're asking of people reasonable? Do they get a sense of purpose and meaning from their work? Do they feel appropriately supported? These things are just basics. They've been around for decades. The research has been there for decades, but unfortunately they're seen as a little bit too hard by a lot of organisations. So they've largely been ignored in favour of a big awareness campaign that may actually do more harm to people. So think about what to do and what not to do. If it's around fix the person, if it's around just awareness, if it's around just mental illness literacy, if it's mental health first aid, if it's resilience-based, just move forward from that. And let's look at the more strategic approaches to things.
Thanks, Dave. And look, yes, the article Dave referenced, we will get the link from Dave and share that post webinar as well, so you can reference that in your own time. Question from Harrison to the panel is that stating that many organisations engage this problem through culture approach for many decades, whether that be through culture, climate, employee surveys. His question: are these now obsolete for assessing psychosocial hazards, and we need to move to an approach like the people at work risk assessment process? Who'd like to tackle that one?
I could probably have a little bit of a crack at it from a layperson's perspective. Employee sentiment surveys will not enable you to assess psychosocial risk. The assessment of psychosocial risk is more than just hazard exposure. It is looking at the exposure, the duration, the intensity, and the impact. So unless your employer engagement surveys can actually give you those sort of detail, it may give you an indication of hazards being there, but it won't assess psychosocial risk itself. So you've got to be very careful. Is it a useful tool at an enterprise level to have part of an indicator of the psychosocial health of your organisation? Sure. Can it be part of a top-down approach? Absolutely, but manifestly insufficient to assess psychosocial risk. Things like people at work, look, not a bad tool, build around the job demands resources model. But again, is it actually telling you risk, or is it actually telling you hazard exposure? But I'll tell you, it's one of the ones that's actually quite useful out there. And I think that the further organisations get progressed in this space, they start to realise that a lot of the things that are being marketed have deficiencies. And we need to go more than just a top-down sort of approach. It's the bottom-up and top-down that is where we're really going to make the biggest impact in this area.
And I think adding to that, David, what I'd sort of say is you need multiple data points to really understand the risk. So I know at Woolworths, we call it Voice of Team, and basically our program is every employee within 3-month period will have the opportunity to do the survey, and we've specifically thought about the questions that will help give us insights, but we're not saying that's the only way we're getting insights to understand our risk. But we are asking specific questions to help us with our assessment, but there are a multitude of other, particularly in the HR space, you've got absenteeism data, you've got turnover, you've got complaints, there's a number of data points that you can pull together to try and understand, your risk exposure.
Great, thank you, Jane. That's an enterprise level. Unless, Steve, was there something there you wanted to add?
I was only going to say, Aaron, to echo Jane's initial point, it's okay that organisations are finding their feet on the source of data here. It is okay that they are getting information at an executive or board level about activity at the moment in the current sphere, as opposed to efficacy, which is the normal health and safety reporting. Health and safety physical systems have been around for decades, and so that's efficacy. It's not activity. It wouldn't behave a board very well to be told we're developing a health and safety system for the first time. But in this area, we are in an area of newness, and so it's no bad thing that the boards are getting that sort of information reported. Can I say this though, that the conversations I've had with directors and executive teams, and some of them really kind of inspiring, there is a sense of I'll call it unease, that they don't have the full picture, that they do not have a sense. They're being told, if you read the Respect at Work report, 1 in 3 women suffer sexual harassment at work. So let's assume that that's a rough guide. Organisations can work out how many women are in their organisation, and so have a general sense of what the reporting story should be. When they're told we had 1 complaint this year in an organisation of multiple thousands, that should create unease. Now, that's not a rush for data or a rush for statistical, perfection, but it should beg the question: how do we get a better handle on the actual experience? Because my human experience and what I'm told about industry is not matching what we're being told organisationally. So how have we improved that conversation, and how are we getting that information through? Now, that's not a metric, that's not a dashboard. We might get there one day, but I don't think we are there. But it's a question, and I think that's the job. I think that's the role of large employers, sophisticated employers. That's the interface between board and management, I think.
A question from a different lens. We're talking about what needs to be funneled up, reported on, from an enterprise level. There's an interesting question around what is the accountability of the individual. So to some extent, individuals have accountability for our own health and well-being, but some employees may seem reluctant to take any accountability at all. So the question is, what are your thoughts on how employers can get change with that cohort?
Can I jump in? I'm seeing the most sophisticated organisations doing the best work in this space are absolutely doing top-down, bottom-up. So you've got your enterprise level, my psychosocial health dashboard, my deeper dives into problematic areas using formal risk assessment processes. But from the bottom up, it's when we're educating people around not mental illness literacy, but workplace mental health, and what are the workplace factors that get in the way of our experience of work. And anyone at any level will tell you what those things are, but how are then the organisations creating a mechanism for people to report up on those things, speak up on those things, and elevate those to their leaders? So what I'm seeing work very well is actually leaders as the first line of defence. Now, every staff member wants to tell you what's wrong and what they want to do to fix it, but are we giving them not just permission, but a mechanism to enable that to happen? Are we equipping our leaders with the capability to actually listen to and understand that information and somewhere to report those psychosocial hazards or issues? So that bottom up, I'm finding when we do it well with an organisation, it works exceptionally well. Everyone wants a better experience of work. It's how do we position these things that makes a big difference. You go and ask someone on the ground around, what are the things causing psychosocial harm, and their eyes will glaze over. We need to make sure that we do this in a way that actually works for people. What I'm finding with my client base is that people are right up for it.
And I think what's been interesting for us at Woolworths as well is in a retail environment, we've got a lot of increasing customer aggression and violence to the point of, like, I'm quite disgusted in community in how we treat our frontline team members. And really that realization that some of our team are just like, that's a part of my job. And it's like, no, it's not a part of your job. We want to hear about this. So the more that we hear, the more that we can do. And again, Dave, you talk about how do you make it easy? So yes, I can tell my line leader and they can report it up and we can go through the whole system. And we've taken a step back going, what's a frictionless way for our teams to report? And we're looking at, what's an easy way on the point of sale where I'm serving the customer and I can report there and then within 3 seconds, something that's occurred, so that we get more insights around the lived experience from our teams and actually can, further manage it. So again, I think it is really important about not talking about what is psychosocial. Like, the reality is, here are the things you're faced with. You're faced with awful customers every day. We know that. So let's make sure that we're talking about it, not just assuming that you just got to be resilient to that awful customer.
And Jane, you make a beautiful point there around what we normalise.
Mm-hmm.
And I think we see this in the professional services space quite a lot as well. As we normalise these massive work weeks and these huge peaks and these sorts of things. And I think, to Steve's point earlier, the regulatory landscape is giving us permission to pause. It's actually making us pause and say, hang on, is that okay? Just because I've been doing it for the last 15 years, is that currently socially acceptable? And is it actually within my requirements of having a psychologically healthy and safe workplace? So I actually love the attention that all these new regulatory landscape is giving to us to actually say, hang on, what are we normalising? What is okay here? What are better ways to work? How do we do better capacity planning? How do we give people a voice?
Fantastic. And Jane, maybe you could start with a response. I mean, your lens is, as you mentioned, from a director of health and safety perspective, wellbeing. Anne's question is, how do we bring in the human resource, people and culture areas? And we touched on this a little bit in the first webinar, but how do we bring them into discussion? They have a significant role, obviously, in behaviour and other areas relevant to this.
Yeah. And look, I'm quite opinionated in this space that it's not safety, it's not HR. It's safety, HR, operations, all coming together on this. And I think last time I talked about, and what I worry is now it's being enshrined in safety legislation. Safety professionals, and hey, I'm a safety professional, are feeling like, well, we've got to manage this. No, there's so many risks that we have to manage that we're never the technical expert. And when I look a lot at the psychosocial elements around good job design, organisational design, they're core domains from a HR professional space. And so I think, what the safety professional brings in is sort of, no offence to the HR professional, probably a little bit more maturity around risk. And we blend that with the HR and we're going to get the best outcomes by doing it together. But I don't think you can do it without the operations and the frontline groups involved in, what are we trying to go after here? So again, I feel, at Woolies, we're working in Agile. And one of the philosophies of Agile is you bring the right people into the team to work on complex problems. So we have got a lot better at safety and HR and the relevant disciplines coming together to try and work on this. But I would say, have we perfected it? No.
Okay.
I like the idea of an employee life cycle approach.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's one way to look at it. But yeah, it's causing a lot of angst, isn't it, around whose job is it? HR's work, health and safety, injury management, what do the role people play? I actually have a framework I've developed that area that I'm happy to share afterwards if anyone's interested, around a generic approach to roles and responsibilities when it comes to psychological health and safety.
I think that'd be useful, though. There's a number of questions around, are there resources or reference points? So again, post-webinar, we'll summarise some of those key documents for you and share them through such that you can refer in your own time. But an interesting question here from Matt, again, open to the panel, is, has there been any consideration of the work systems that apply at a personal level, including cultural dimensions and the impact of the same work stresses, psychosocial risks across many cultures within an organisation? What works for one culture may not work for someone from a different culture, hence there could be broad variability in terms of, what's sound for one worker may not be suitable for another. Who'd like to have a crack at that one?
I'd love to hear Dave's thoughts, but if I just make a quick observation, my perspective on the way in which businesses are facing into this, or the ones that I'm sort of talking to, there's a real struggle. It's undeniable that there's a challenge about how to pitch the analysis. If you do an enterprise-wide psychosocial safety risk assessment, it'll be thin, a veneer of analysis. If you try to do an assessment of every human being in the organisation and their resilience, you'd probably get a rich story, but you'd have to close the business down while we all sat around and assessed each other. So there is a challenge, which I think Matt's observation speaks to, about where do you pitch this? How do you do meaningful work? And I think it's got to be the work I've seen clients do well is to pick meaningful cohorts of people who've got a similar lived experience at work. And so, well, what can we learn about them? And even if within that, then there's a subculture, we can analyze that. But it is a vexed question. Where do you draw the line? And is one risk assessment for a 1,000-person enterprise enough? I think the answer has to be no. Do we need to do them in teams of 5? Well, not with the same degree of rigor, but there's got to be some medium point between the two. So I do think this is one of the operationalization challenges, to be honest, of these laws.
And I think for me, it's beyond culture. It's a great question, Matt. And hello from many years ago. It's a great question. It's also beyond culture. It's around thinking about disability and inclusion as well. So there's many different diversity factors that might influence someone's lived experience.
I think one of the big things that it does speak to, thanks, Jane and Steve, is that there's a non-linear relationship between hazard exposure and likelihood of harm.
Yep.
And this is where organisations are tripping over themselves at the moment, using the old bow ties or just a standard sort of hazard control type of models, because psychosocial risk itself is multifactorial. I don't know about the cultural piece. I'd like to learn more about that, but we do know that the moderators of hazard exposure are individual vulnerability, person job fit, life events, all those things going on, previous history of mental health related concerns. Is my job designed in a way where the resources available to me are sufficient? Are the demands too high? Do I have good role clarity? And also, how am I supported within the organisation itself? So there's a lot of things that actually moderate that likely risk of harm. And you can't take out that individual element. Just because I might be impacted by something doesn't mean that someone else is going to be impacted in the same way. And this is where you can't stick with the sort of linear hazard risk outcome based approaches when we look at this organisationally wide. This is why the importance of exposure, duration, frequency and impact on individual is such an important consideration from that risk management perspective, which is something not encapsulated in the majority of the tools that are being marketed in this space.
No,
although, Dave, I'm going to be contentious because I've had this contentious conversation with you, is I think all organisations need to start somewhere. So
I completely agree, Jane.
We did both high on this, and the reason why it was great, it just got a common language. It got the people in the room talking common language, and from there I kind of see it as a funnel. You start out really wide and then you go deeper and deeper using different ways of thinking about your risk. So again, I know there's a few people saying, what risk assessment tool should I use? I think the big one is there is no one risk assessment tool. And that, you'll also evolve your understanding over time as well.
Yeah, look, and I agree. And you've got to start somewhere, and it is new for a lot of people. Despite Copenhagen Psychosocial Questionnaire coming out in the year 2000, Guarding Minds at Work in 2008, HSC having their stuff, 2 decades ago, like it's new to a lot of business. Providers hadn't found a way to monetize it yet, but look at all the people in the market now, suddenly psychosocial experts. It's, that's another conversation. The challenge that I often see with the linear approaches is when there's an over-reliance on, we've got a job demand issue, therefore this is what we're going to do to control it. But job demand itself is actually a complex area. Is the hindrance demand a challenge demand? Is the job demand driven through a lack of FTE? Is it driven through a lack of role clarity? Is it driven through role conflict? What about the influence of leadership behaviour? So where organisations, the more sophisticated organisations are heading to in this space is looking at a more sophisticated way of looking at and unpacking what does psychosocial hazards mean? How does that impact our people? And I'm yet to see a tool, and I've probably worked with just about all of them now, that actually does give you anything other than what you knew or suspected in the first place, or that can actually beat going and talking to and engaging with your people. You need that qualitative data to tell you and make sense of any of those metrics that are coming up.
I mean, that's my strong sense is that, and I echo Jane's point, you know, organisations need to move somewhere. We can hold two ideas in our head, the importance of getting this right, but that we will not hit a standard of perfection of people's experience at work. And I do find, you know, if there is a downside to introducing, you know, strong legislative foundations for all of this, it's that we can freeze up organisations that they can think we can't do anything because it might create a stressful environment for our staff. Well, that's not the challenge we're looking to drive towards. Stress is a natural part of work, and without it, God, life would be dull. So, you know, there is this kind of calibration exercise which I think is happening at the moment, and stepping back from, we've got to, as I said earlier, you know, and to be really clear, you know, it can't be that the output of this is that we create an environment at work that is perfect for everybody, because that would be highly unproductive, I imagine, and not particularly energizing, and wouldn't drive people to improve. But there is that challenge.
Wouldn't be good for people's mental health.
Say again?
It wouldn't be good for people's mental health.
Well,
we
there's
need
that.
those ups and downs. You know, we need the challenges. That's actually really important for people.
Which is why I get return to work is such a critical part of injury recovery, getting people back and getting them feeling that sense of connection and normalizing. You know, those are all important things the professionals will tell us. I
love the idea of work as a protective factor.
Yeah.
And that's where, if I think, where is this heading? It's a realization around, yes, sure, there's risks inherent with work. We simply cannot eliminate most of those psychosocial risks. It's just not possible. They're inherent within so many roles, but how can we actually make work a protective factor for people's mental health and wellbeing? Purpose and meaning, engagement, you know, growth and learning, respect, inclusion, job security. These are all things there that you don't need a giant risk assessment in order to influence that. That's stuff that we can just give people by being decent in the way which we approach work.
Yeah, and I have perceived that, you know, your point earlier, Dave, is so spot on, that the intuition that connected leaders have about the genuine hotspots in the organisation, the areas where people work in isolation, the people who are in, you know, teams with low leadership capability, the areas where there are high hours of work or low job control. Most people could list those today without overly sophisticated risk assessment tools. The next question is, what are you going to do about it? What is the actual, and it's that, I think, which is the hard part about this, that openness to change and to challenging that kind of normalized behavior. Yeah, of course, these are high stress jobs. This is what we do, to something different, which says, well, this is how we can support those people.
And not relying on a resilience type approach or a fix the person approach is then how do we get organisations to sufficiently understand what good job design looks like?
Yeah.
How do we do good capacity planning? How do we look at upstream stressors? I love this idea of when we're sort of moving further upstream around, if you've got aggressive customers, how come? What are the things creating that frustration? How are we addressing those things that are upstream? If we've got a period,
well, as an example, Dave, you know, a call holding wait time for 20 minutes before someone goes to the call centre, you're not setting up the call centre for success. And that is a thing which an employer can control. The actual behaviour of the customer, less so. The individual response, less so. But there is in that, you know, quick story there, clearly a risk control which can be implemented.
And I look at
that's the way to think about it, I think, not about the incident, but the system.
Just, I guess, a question to the panel, interested in your views. I mean, in our world, when we're working with organisations around identifying talent, we're seeing a lot of role creation in the areas of, you know, broader wellbeing, but particularly, you know, now in that psychosocial risk. And I think Dave and I have certainly, talked to the fact that the number of people that exist with the skill sets and capability are as rare as a unicorn, you know, wearing a blue dress. So how do we?
Good client, Dave.
How do we work towards? And to Jane's point, organisations are starting somewhere and doing something, and part of that is, you know, how do we grow the people internally within our businesses to support these strategies? You know, how do we secure and attract, you know, others external to the organisation and funnel them in? Do you have any views on that?
It's a tough one. And who are organisations listening to? I mean, I've had an unfortunate situation where a senior organisational psychologist advising a business is advocating for critical incident stress debriefing and mental health first aid. You know, we've got to be very careful who we listen to, and our education system has not done a good job in developing the capabilities we need here. I understand if people are looking for courses, that Associate Professor Carlo Carpanecchia from UNSW may be actually bringing out some form of a qualification in this space as well. I know he's got some programs and things there that can really help people lift people's capability. There was a Canadian course out for quite some time there around psychological health and safety, getting a certificate in that. But our industry base has not done well. We haven't necessarily trained all psychs in the workplace factors that influence well-being, and clin psychs typically have a focus on fixing the individual. I think OTs, I think the multidisciplinary approaches, I think they're really, really useful in this space. But where are we actually giving people the knowledge base and the capability base is a really good question.
And I think, my comments are, my thoughts are, go back 20 years ago, 25 years ago in the health and safety space and look at the safety professional then to where hopefully safety professionals are now. And it's changing, and quite a dramatic paradigm shift in a lot of thinking in that space. So again, I wouldn't be going on, I can't do anything because I don't have anyone with expertise. Yes, there are consultants out there that you can bring in, absolutely. But also look about, I think, Dave, you've nutted it there around that multidisciplinary. You'll have people that may not know it end to end, but have got components that you can draw in to focus on specific areas.
Yeah, Jane, absolutely. And one of the things I'm seeing more of is partnering with big organisations to help them deal with the more complex psychosocial risk issues. And then by doing that, helping them bring up their capabilities internally so they can manage more and more in-house. So that's one model I'm seeing quite a lot with a lot of big businesses at the moment. I think it's a challenge too. A lot of health and safety professionals didn't necessarily come willingly into the psychological health domain. And I know some of the clients, because we do a lot of work trying to upskill health and safety professionals so they know what they've got to do, there's often a lot of reluctance there around, I didn't sign up to do the psychological stuff as well. So, I think it's a really interesting space at the moment around, how do we actually support organisations to get this right?
Yeah, and I know everyone's asking for a lot of resources, which we'll share afterwards. Again, this is a little bit of a plug about an organisation called the Corporate Mental Health Alliance. There's some great resources on there, particularly for small and medium businesses. So I'll pop it in the chat, but there's a lot of resources out there as well to support you.
I'll plug the regulators in that space too. They're putting out more resources and better stuff than just about any of the providers. So Safe Work New South Wales in particular, doing a really good job.
Now, lots of other questions that have come through that, as we found last time, in an hour, we don't have enough time to cover all. But what we will do is make sure that we do screenshot as many of them as we possibly can and come back to you in follow-up to respond to those. But I guess perhaps if I can just go one last time to each of the panel in terms of, your final words of wisdom in terms of, businesses and leaders that are addressing these issues internally within their businesses, from today onwards. What would you share with them, Steve, in parting comments?
I just think you need to start. To Jane's point, the commencement of the conversation around this, informed, I think, by the intuitive sense of the areas of particular likely risk in the workplace is essential. There's nothing for it now. Any organisation, and I'm, as hopefully many of you know, not a you're all going to jail type, but it is the case that regulators are knocking on doors and asking the question, can you demonstrate to me that you've taken the steps to comply with the Act? It's the case that health and safety reps are emboldened to raise these issues, rightly so in many cases, perhaps not all, but that these are issues that are right in the conversation now. Where you don't want to be is nowhere, or be left behind, or have kind of frozen up and not taken some initial steps. So, all activity by and large is positive, I think.
Great. Thank you, Steve. Jane, final words of wisdom?
Probably for me is know that it's a marathon and it's a journey. And that, kind of building off what Steve said, don't put your head in the sand, is you've got to start somewhere. Don't think that you're going to crack it straight away and you're suddenly going to have this amazing way of tackling it. If you do, please, I'm sure Dave,
sell it.
Steve, you'll want to sell it. But just know that this is going to be something you're going to continue to iterate and build upon. And that, where we were 6 months ago to where we are now, it feels like a month, a lot has changed. And again, there's resources out there. And I think, sessions like this where we can share and collaborate, I think we'll be in a whole different space probably in 3 years' time, 10 years' time, and probably 20 years' time.
Great. Thank you, Jane. And Dave, the final word.
be careful who you listen to in this space. And this is not directed at Jane and Steve. I admire the work they're doing in this space, and I'm really grateful to be on the panel with them. Go top down, bottom up in the way in which you look at psychosocial risk management. Simplify it. Make it easy for people, and maybe think around, it takes time to build your psychosocial safety systems, but leaders can be your first line of defense, and there are things that you can do right now that will genuinely influence people's experience of work. So there's things you can do. Don't panic.
Great. Thank you, Dave. And thank you again to all of our panelists for giving up their time and contributing lots of commentary around the pragmatic examples and responses shared. And again, that is greatly appreciated. It's clearly an important topic, and an opportunity, I guess, for all of us and our businesses that we work within. Understanding the individual's lived experience at work is key and critical. Understanding what aspects of that are really positive, what aspects need some improvement, and then it's kind of what can we do and how do we go about it, which sound like they're the most important things. So, and to use Jane's point, start somewhere and then build from there, in terms of improving that moving forward. So we hope you found it really valuable. Please feel free to reach out, directly if you'd like to, some further feedback. We will share resources. Connect with us. We can connect you with the panelists as you would like if you're not already connected. And also just please keep an eye out for a survey that will come out in the coming week, just in and around feedback for this session. Equally, we'd love your feedback on any future topics that might be of interest. This one will be an ongoing one, and we may well revisit, but certainly one that's on your screen at the moment that may also take your interest is around diversity and inclusion, and asking whether you're making headway. So that webinar will be on the 27th of July. So keep an eye out for invitations for that. Equally, any other feedback that you have or any other information you would like, we'll share as much as we can moving forward. So thank you to everyone for attending, and thank you again to our panelists for their time today.